Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I was folding laundry in the corner of the living room, methodically matching socks and smoothing the sleeves of shirts that didn't belong to me, because in this house, routines were often the only thing that kept the noise of dismissal from echoing too loudly in my ears. The dryer hummed softly in the background, a low, steady reminder that some things, at least, were predictable. I had just stacked the last folded towel when I heard the footsteps firm, slow, deliberate coming down the hallway. My father entered the room with his usual air of authority, not bothering to glance in my direction, not pausing before delivering the words that would drop into the space like a stone through glass. "Pack your things, your sister needs your room," he said, tone flat, as if it were just another line item on his internal checklist, something as ordinary as asking me to take out the trash or move the car from the driveway. I didn't speak at first. I didn't even look up. I just stood there, one hand still resting on the edge of the laundry basket, trying to process the sheer audacity of what had just been said with all the warmth of a shrug. There was no conversation, no explanation, no hint of discomfort in his voice, just that same damn assumption that I would, as always, make room, step aside, disappear a little more to make space for Claire. He didn't stay long enough for me to respond. He just turned and walked away, leaving silence in his wake, as though my presence had never been worth lingering for in the first place. And yet, I wasn't surprised. I wish I could say I was shocked or hurt or blindsided, but the truth is, this wasn't the first time I'd been told, explicitly or not, that my space wasn't really mine, that whatever I occupied could be claimed by someone more deserving, someone louder. Someone shinier, someone with a name that made their eyes light up instead of glaze over. Claire had always been the sun to their orbit, the one whose mistakes were called missteps, whose tantrums were emotional growth, whose mediocrity was just a late bloomer's journey. I was the background noise, the responsible one, the one who handled things quietly so they wouldn't have to. I was the family's emotional janitor, cleaning up messes no one acknowledged, making sacrifices no one noticed, always expected to adjust, never celebrated for holding everything together behind the scenes. And maybe the most infuriating part was that I didn't scream. I didn't throw the laundry basket across the room or chase after him to demand answers. I didn't cry or plead or even raise my voice. I just stood there, breathing slowly, my mind sharper than my silence would ever suggest. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this house didn't belong to him anymore. Not in the way he thought. Weeks ago, after overhearing a conversation between him and my mother about falling behind on the mortgage, I did something they never expected from their forgettable, obedient daughter. I started doing research, quietly, methodically, the same way I'd done everything in my life on my own. I checked foreclosure notices. I called city offices. I made a few calls to an auction office 2 towns over. And one Tuesday morning, while everyone else was still asleep, I submitted a bid. They had no idea I was the one who bought this house, my childhood home, at a foreclosure auction for less than the cost of the car Claire totaled last year. They had no idea the ownership papers were already in transit. They had no idea that the invisible daughter they kept shoving into corners now held the deed to every room they walked through like royalty. Have you ever been told, in your own home, that you are nothing more than an extra? Have you ever felt like the furniture got more consideration than your future? Tell me in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one who smiled through clenched teeth, made space for people who never made space for you, or swallowed bitterness just to keep the peace that was never really yours to begin with. I walked down the hallway slowly, toward my room, the room I'd spent years retreating into like a sanctuary, the one they now thought could be handed over without a second thought. I sat on the edge of my bed, glanced toward the bookshelf, and let my eyes settle on the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside, neatly tucked beneath a folder of old receipts and unopened greeting cards, was a manila envelope with my name on it and a crisp white document that read property transfer, finalized ownership deed. I reached down and ran my fingers across the edge of that folder, letting a slow smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Then I whispered softly to no one in particular, "Sure, I'll start packing." I think the part that still stings the most isn't the dismissal, it's the casualness of it all, the way my presence has always been treated like a placeholder, like an afterthought, like a detail they'd meant to get around to appreciating, but never quite found the time. It didn't start with that moment in the living room. No, it started years before, years of small slights stacked quietly like bricks, building a wall between who I was and who they expected me to be. You learn, after a while, not to take up too much space in a family like mine. You learn to shrink, to nod politely, to swallow your disappointment before it's had time to settle in your throat. I remember being 8 years old and dressed in a new leotard for my first dance recital, sitting by the auditorium door with a crumpled program in my hand, waiting for someone, anyone, to walk through the doors. My name was called, my group took the stage, and I danced with a lump in my chest and an empty seat in the audience. Claire had a stomachache that day, and they stayed home with her. They told me later that they were sorry, but we'll make it up to you. They didn't. I remember birthdays that came and went like ordinary days, with store-bought cake slices and offhand remarks about how, next year, we'll plan something special. Meanwhile, Claire had full-blown garden parties, themed decorations, and entire weekends blocked off in her honor. I was expected to help set the table for hers and quietly unwrap my own gifts alone in the kitchen when mine came around. There was always some reason why she needed more time, more attention, more space, more grace for her flaws. I, on the other hand, was held to the standard of quiet excellence. Not because they celebrated it, but because they expected it. I was the stable one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need to be fussed over because Rachel can handle herself. But handling yourself doesn't mean you don't deserve to be held once in a while. They never learned that part. You start to notice patterns when you're raised to serve instead of speak. You stop asking questions, stop sharing your wins, stop hoping for a reaction. You celebrate yourself in silence because making noise feels selfish. But eventually, that silence grows teeth. And mine had started to sharpen years ago. The house had always felt like a metaphor for everything unspoken. Cracks in the walls no one bothered to fix, windows that stuck no matter how often they were cleaned, lights that flickered just enough to be annoying, but not enough to get attention. And just like everything else, I was expected to work around it. I still remember the first time I heard them mention selling it. I had walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and paused just outside the doorway when I heard my father say, "It's not worth much anyway. Old place, more trouble than it's worth." My mother had agreed, laughing softly. If we ever did sell, it'd be just to get it off our hands. I should have been hurt. But I wasn't. I was curious. Curious enough to do what they never expected me to do, research. A week later, I overheard our neighbor, Mr. Keller, muttering to another neighbor about a foreclosure list he'd seen posted at the county clerk's office. Poor folks across the street, he'd said, not realizing I was standing just behind the hedge. Can't imagine the stress, losing your house like that. Something in me clicked. That night, I opened my laptop and started digging. And there it was, our address, listed quietly on a foreclosure pre-auction page, marked as eligible for bidding within 30 days if the back payments weren't made. My heart was pounding as I clicked through the paperwork, read through the terms, and stared at the screen for hours. I didn't tell anyone. Not a soul. Not because I was being deceptive, but because I knew exactly how they would react if I did. They wouldn't take me seriously. They never had. So I waited. I watched. And when the window opened, I submitted my bid, anonymously, carefully, through an LLC I created in my name that no one in my family knew existed. The process moved faster than I expected, and every step felt like a small reclaiming of the space I had been told for years wasn't really mine. And then, on an ordinary afternoon while I was packing a box just to keep up the illusion, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. Purchase confirmed. Deed transfer in progress. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen, letting the words settle like warm cement beneath my feet. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt undeniable. There's something unspoken about the quiet years, the ones where you grind in silence, unnoticed by the very people who are supposed to see you first. I spent most of my 20s building something no one cared to acknowledge, stacking pennies while Claire spent hers burning through credit cards in places I couldn't afford to dream about. I wasn't traveling to Europe to find myself or hopping between boyfriends and yoga retreats like she did. I was working double shifts, clipping coupons, sleeping in studio apartments that smelled like dust and mildew, and reading financial literacy blogs at 2 in the morning while Claire slept in the guest room and talked about how she just needed a little more time to figure things out. No one questioned her. No one pushed her. No one ever asked where the money was coming from or when she planned to contribute to anything that wasn't a cocktail bill or a weekend getaway. My parents would wave it off with that familiar, indulgent shrug and say, "She's just taking her time. She's still exploring her options." Meanwhile, my options were limited to which grocery store had better discounts on canned soup. But while they were busy making excuses for her, I was building a credit score like it was my religion. I was socking away every extra dollar I could find: birthday checks, side gigs, late-night freelance work, things I never bragged about because no one asked. I didn't need applause. I needed leverage. I didn't know exactly when it would come in handy, but I knew, deep down, I needed something to anchor me when I inevitably got pushed aside again. And then the house situation fell into my lap like a silent blessing wrapped in decades of resentment. I remember walking into the county courthouse on a cloudy Wednesday afternoon, wearing my work clothes and carrying a folder that held every piece of paperwork I had double-checked 3 times. The building smelled like aged paper and floor wax, and the fluorescent lights above made everything feel colder than it actually was. I took a deep breath before stepping up to the counter, handed over the documents, and waited as the clerk clicked her way through the system. After a few minutes, she looked up with a casual smile and said, "Congratulations, new owner of a hell of a deal." I nodded once, thanking her, but I didn't smile until I stepped outside into the fresh air, the papers in my hand feeling heavier than they should have, but not in a burdensome way. They were heavy in the way crowns are heavy, earned, carried, and meant to shift weight from your shoulders to your spine. The house didn't feel the same anymore after that. I walked through the hallway with different eyes, not just as someone passing through, but as someone who knew where the ownership line had been redrawn. Every creaking floorboard, every outdated fixture, every little imperfection suddenly became mine, not in the way children are told to take pride in their home, but in the way landlords do, quiet, firm-rooted. I started packing a little more that week, just to keep up appearances. I pulled old boxes from the top shelf of my closet, the ones no one ever noticed, filled with college essays, faded photographs, tax documents, and saved receipts. I wasn't moving out, not in the way they thought, but I was making space, mentally, emotionally, physically. I was clearing the old version of myself out of the shadows and making room for the version that owned the damn deed. One afternoon, while I was wrapping a stack of books in old newspaper, my mother peeked her head into my room. Her tone was light, too light, like someone trying to pretend everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. "You're being dramatic, you know," she said with a little laugh. "It's just a room. You don't have to make such a show of it." I looked at her, then down at the book in my hand, a worn copy of Jane Eyre I'd kept since college. I smiled slowly, politely, almost sympathetically. "I'm not making a show of anything," I said. "I'm just making sure things are where they belong." She didn't ask what that meant. She never did. She just sighed and walked away, probably thinking I was sulking again, too sensitive, too brooding. But what she didn't know was that everything I touched in that room was a line I was drawing, a boundary, a decision, a piece of proof that I had never really belonged here the way they thought I did. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the old oak tree in the backyard, I watched from the window as the mail carrier made his usual stop at the end of the driveway. He slid a stack of envelopes into the box and drove off without pause. I waited a few minutes, then stepped outside, heart thudding quietly beneath my ribs. There it was, thicker than the others, with the county seal stamped across the corner and my anonymous LLC listed as the sender. A sealed envelope labeled "Property Transfer Documents." And it was sitting in their mailbox, right where they'd find it, right before dinner. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air as I set the last plate on the table, pretending not to notice the subtle glances exchanged between my parents every time I moved through the kitchen. There was always a heavy kind of quiet in our home before dinner, an odd hush that wasn't about peace, but about performance, like we were all getting into costume before the curtain rose. Claire had taken her usual seat at the end of the table, legs crossed, fingers lazily scrolling through her phone as if the world needed her approval before it could spin. My father sat at the head, fork and knife already arranged in perfect symmetry, eyes flicking toward the doorway like he was waiting for someone to praise him for his patience. My mother busied herself with water glasses and napkins, though it was clear from her stiff movements that her nerves were already working overtime. I took my place without saying much, sliding into the seat I'd used for years, the one no one ever offered to switch or upgrade because I had always just accepted what was handed to me. The chairs creaked faintly as we settled in, and for a few minutes it almost resembled something close to normal. But I could feel the tension beneath the table like a second layer of air, too still, too thick, too full of things left unsaid. As the food was passed around, my father cleared his throat in that way he always did when he wanted the room to pause long enough to let his words soak in. "Claire just started at that boutique I told you about," he announced proudly, his voice loud enough to reach the windows, though we all sat less than a foot apart. "They said she's got real style, a real eye for retail." He looked around like he expected applause, like this moment was supposed to be cemented in family history as a milestone worthy of celebration. My mother nodded eagerly, echoing his sentiment with a bright, rehearsed smile. "That's wonderful," I said softly, my fork slicing through a piece of chicken as I kept my eyes on my plate, not because I was being dismissive, but because I didn't have the energy to fake the kind of enthusiasm they always demanded for anything related to Claire. What I didn't mention, of course, was the promotion I had quietly received 2 weeks ago, a role that came with a salary bump, benefits, and my own small office downtown. I hadn't told them, not because it wasn't worth sharing, but because I'd long since stopped offering pieces of my life to people who only clapped when the story wasn't mine. The mail was passed around somewhere between the potatoes and the green beans, a pile of envelopes dropped unceremoniously in the middle of the table, as if the contents couldn't possibly contain anything important. My father flipped through the stack without looking too closely: utility bill, junk mail, a magazine subscription he never canceled, and then there it was. A thick envelope with county letterhead and a return address from the property clerk's office. He opened it casually at first, still mid-sentence about Claire's natural gift for merchandising, but his words slowed as he slid the papers out, and the silence that followed was so sudden it was almost audible. His hands went still, fingers no longer flipping through pages, eyes scanning the document once, then again, then a third time like the words might rearrange themselves into something he could understand. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but nothing came out. For the first time I could remember, my father was speechless. "What is it?" my mother asked, leaning over to peek at the letter in his hands. She tilted her head, squinting as she followed the lines of text, and I watched as the color drained from her face like someone had pulled the plug on her composure. This is a deed transfer," she said slowly, her voice brittle, as if each syllable came with splinters. "This house, it's been sold?" Dad's jaw clenched. "This says the buyer is," he trailed off, eyes narrowing as he reread the name listed on the document, the name of the LLC I had formed quietly, in my own name, weeks ago. It was there in black and white, bold and undeniable: new legal owner, R. Lane Property Group, LLC. His head snapped up, eyes meeting mine across the table with a mixture of disbelief and something I couldn't quite name, something that looked a lot like fear. And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply picked up my fork again, took another bite of roasted carrots, chewed slowly, and swallowed with deliberate calm. Then I looked him in the eye and said, "I figured it was time I owned something around here." The silence after my words wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, stretching across the dinner table like thick smoke, curling around their throats and choking the false sense of order that had held this house together for decades. My father still held the deed in his hands, gripping it tighter now, as if the ink might smudge or the letters might vanish if he stared hard enough. My mother blinked rapidly, her mouth slightly open, stunned into a state of disbelief that didn't suit her well, and Claire simply froze, eyes darting between all of us like she'd walked into a play she didn't understand, but was still somehow the star of. It didn't take long for the dam to break. "You went behind our backs?" My mother snapped, the edge in her voice returning quicker than I expected. "You bought this house without telling us? After everything we've done for you?" I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice, didn't even bother to stop chewing for a moment. I calmly placed my fork on my plate and looked directly at her. "After everything you've done for me?" I repeated softly, but with the kind of tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "You mean the forgotten birthdays? The years of pretending I was just some extra piece of furniture you could move around as needed? Or was it when you told me to pack my things so Claire could have more space, that the favor you're referring to?" My father slammed the paper onto the table, eyes narrowed, the muscle in his jaw twitching like it did whenever he lost control of the narrative. "Why would you do this?" he demanded, as if my name on that deed had insulted him personally. "What were you trying to prove, Rachel?" "I wasn't trying to prove anything," I said evenly, leaning back in my chair. "I was making a decision. One you could have made yourselves if you'd been paying attention to anything besides Claire's latest whims. You want to know how this happened? You want a timeline? Fine. I'll give you one." I folded my hands, calm as ever, and continued. "A few months ago, I heard you two talking about how the mortgage was falling behind. A week later, I overheard the neighbors talking about the pre-foreclosure listing. I checked the public records, saw the auction details, and did what any rational adult would do when they realize no one else is steering the ship. I bought it." "But that's not fair," Mom snapped again, almost sputtering now. "We didn't even get a chance to what?" I cut in, sharper now. "To save the house you already let slip into foreclosure? To make another excuse for why I should stay in the background while you two play house with Claire as your center stage. You could have told us." Dad barked, his voice growing louder now, desperate to regain control. "And what would you have done?" I asked, not blinking. "Laughed it off? Told me I was overreacting, like every other time I dared to take up space? You told me to pack my things. So I did. I packed up the part of me that needed your approval. I packed the version of myself who waited for recognition, who hoped you'd see me without needing a crisis to notice I was in the room." Claire finally spoke then, her voice brittle and confused, as though it had only just hit her that this wasn't about a bedroom at all. "I didn't ask for your room," she said quietly. I turned to her, not with anger, but with the kind of pointed clarity that only someone who's been pushed to the edge can muster without breaking. "This isn't about the room," I said, my voice low and final. "It's about a lifetime of being pushed aside so you could stretch your arms a little wider. It's about how every corner of this house has been shaped around your comfort while I was told to fold myself smaller every time I walked in." Claire shrank back slightly, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't try to argue. Maybe for once, she realized she had nothing to say. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping gently against the floor, not in haste or dramatics, but with absolute control. I looked around the table one last time, taking in the stunned silence, the paper still sitting like a threat in the middle of their perfect dinner table, the empty plates suddenly feeling colder than the food left on them. Then I smiled, not smugly, not with vengeance, but with the kind of freedom that only comes when you finally stop waiting for permission to exist in your own story. "You'll need to speak to the landlord," I said quietly, grabbing my water glass and taking one last sip before turning toward the hallway, before making any further changes. There's a kind of satisfaction that doesn't roar or rattle the walls. It's quieter, deeper, and far more permanent than the explosive kind. It sits in your bones like peace finally finding a place to rest after years of being chased off by silence and side comments. That's the kind of satisfaction I carried with me in the days after everything came out, not because I'd humiliated anyone or delivered some grand, fiery revenge, but because I had reclaimed something that was mine long before the deed ever had my name on it. I didn't gloat. I didn't change the locks or pack their things in boxes or post some triumphant announcement online. I just kept moving forward, with the kind of deliberate calm that unnerves people more than any outburst ever could. I made decisions in the same way I had made every sacrifice before, quietly, efficiently, without anyone else's permission. I decided to stay in the house, not to cling to some sentimental idea of home, but to redefine it completely. I began renovating the upstairs, room by room, choosing paint colors no one had ever asked my opinion on, replacing creaky doors that had annoyed me since childhood, and finally fixing the uneven floorboard by the hallway that my father always said wasn't worth the trouble. Now it was mine to fix. Now it mattered. Now it felt like something I could shape, not something I had to shrink inside. The downstairs remained mostly untouched for a while, not out of laziness, but out of intention. I wasn't in a rush to erase the past. I just wasn't going to keep living beneath it anymore. I turned the second bedroom into an office space, a place I could close the door and build something bigger than any room they'd ever tried to confine me to. I launched a small project I'd been dreaming of for years, financial literacy workshops for young women who came from families like mine, where independence was discouraged and money was a subject wrapped in guilt and control. I wanted to teach women how to build credit, save without shame, invest in themselves without needing validation, and, most importantly, own their own damn space in the world without apology. The workshop started with 3 women in a borrowed library meeting room and grew faster than I ever imagined, because apparently I wasn't the only one who had been told to stay small in houses built on someone else's name. One afternoon, not long after I finalized some additional permits for the property renovations, my father stopped by unannounced. He didn't come to argue. He didn't come to lecture. He just stood on the porch for a few minutes before finally knocking, like the door now carried a weight he hadn't realized before. I opened it, arms crossed loosely, leaning against the frame. He didn't step inside. He held a small envelope, probably hoping I'd mistake it for something formal or serious, but it was just a blank card with a few scribbled lines that read more like a corporate memo than an apology. "Didn't mean to make you feel that way," it said. "You've always been capable." I just didn't say it enough. I nodded. I didn't thank him. I didn't pretend it was more than it was. I said, "Okay," and nothing else. Because sometimes you don't need to burn bridges, you just stop crossing them. And sometimes a nod is louder than forgiveness when respect arrives 20 years too late. A week later, my mother left a note of her own. It wasn't so much an apology as it was a last-ditch guilt trip, a few tear-stained lines about family bonds and regret and how things used to be, slipped under the door like a relic from a version of her that still believed guilt was a form of currency. I didn't even read it twice. I folded it, tucked it into a drawer I rarely opened, and went back to my renovation plans. Because the truth is, sometimes you don't fight for respect. You don't scream or plead or try to prove yourself to people who only love you when it's convenient. Sometimes you just buy the ground they used to stand on and build your own damn house on top of it, quietly, beautifully, unapologetically. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't screaming. It's sitting quietly in the chair they said you didn't deserve to touch. So, tell me, was I wrong to take the house? Or did I just finally move into the space they never let me claim?